This lecture covers Judith A.M. Scully's essay, Eugenics, Women of Color and Reproductive Health, The Saga Continues, and Angela Davis's seminal essay, Racism, Birth Control, and Reproductive Rights, from her 1982 book, Women, Race, and Class. Let's begin with this quotation from Dorothy Roberts in her book, Killing the Black Body. It is amazing how effective governments, especially our own, are at making sterilization and contraceptives available to women of color, despite their inability to reach these women with prenatal care, drug treatment, and other health services. As early as 1914, American feminists like Nina Loy argued that our society must establish the right to maternity on a woman's own terms. In many ways, this is still a radical demand today in the third decade of the 21st century. As Angela Davis reminds us, voluntary motherhood was considered completely outrageous by politicians, leaders, and husbands in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, who argued that the question of a woman's agency over her own reproduction has no bearing, since wives had no right to refuse their husband's sexual urges. When Davis is writing her essay in 1970, the call for the means to a right of voluntary motherhood, that is, legal and easily accessible abortions, was still considered outlandish. When we are reading this essay in 2022, we have just witnessed the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which established the right to abortions prior to 24 weeks or fetal viability, and the criminalization of abortion in 14 states, with 5 allowing for no exceptions, as of September 21st, 2022. Angela Davis and Judith Scully will both argue that reproductive justice is about more than just access to abortions. They argue that true reproductive justice includes birth control, full range of choice, safe contraception methods, and abortion when necessary, but also freedom from forced or coerced sterilizations and freedom from population control measures. In order for the latter two criteria to be met, reproductive justice advocates need to look at the issue of reproductive justice through an intersectional lens. If they do, they will find that the state has been using birth control and sterilizations to forcibly eradicate the potential of women of color to reproduce, and that even the feminist birth control movement has been riddled with racism. Let's look at these intertwined histories now. You may remember this infographic from our first module. This conception of modern society was used by Anne Fausto Sterling to help us understand how the two-sex, two-gender system became the building block of a society. Fausto Sterling borrows this theory of modern society from the French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault. Let's expand this theory now. Foucault argues that in our society, there are two forms of what he calls biopower. Biopower is the term he uses to describe the new mechanisms and tactics of power focused on life, that is, individual bodies and populations, distinguishing such mechanisms from those that exert their influence within the legal and political sphere of a sovereign power, where it was in older hierarchical societies. Remember, the king held all the power in a monarchical society, and the people below him followed the rules because the king had the right to take their lives. There are two types of biopower. The first is biopower centered on the individual body. This is considered the internalization of self-discipline. In other words, we no longer have the fear that the king will kill us, but we continue to follow the rules and abide by the norms of the social body, because we have internalized these rules. We know if we don't follow them, we will be kicked out of the social body at best and subject to violence at worst. So we start to police our own bodies to fit into the social body. The best way to think about this is through the idea of the panopticon. The panopticon was an idea about how to more efficiently structure prisons by a man named Jeremy Bentham. In 1785, Bentham proposed a circular prison. In the center of the prison would be a tall watchtower called the panopticon, or all-seeing eye. A guard in that tower would have a 360 view of all the cells, which were built to open out into the middle of the circle. The concept of the design is to allow prisoners of an institution to be observed by one single security guard, without the inmates being able to tell whether they are being watched. Even though the guard could not actually watch every prisoner all the time, the prisoners would start behaving as if they were being watched at all times, effectively policing themselves in order to avoid getting in trouble. Today, we may call this Big Brother or the man, but no matter what we call it, or even if we don't realize it at all, we have been socialized to police our own bodies and behaviors at all times in keeping with changing social norms. Think about all the ways you police your body during the day and even at night, when there are people around and when no one is around. The second type of biopower works at the population level and is carried on by the state in most cases. The state, that is, the governing bodies of a society, develop the survey and statistical methods to supervise and manage bodies. Think about all of the data and information the state collects through the census, through health records, through traveler information, on and on. The state then uses that information to encourage the increase of births and mortality rates, the health, the life expectancy, and the longevity of those populations that are believed to properly belong in the social body. This may sound a little abstract, but consider the recent pandemic we all went through. The government established vaccination programs so people could access vaccines for free. It shared best practices for staying safe. It determined who could travel and when and where. Even those funny little food pyramid and plate diagrams we learned about when we were young are all ways to manage the social body's health and life expectancy. But as controversial as these programs are, it is really the flip side of the state's mandate to protect the social body so that it can reproduce that is sinister. This is the state's right to destroy or eradicate all those populations deemed a threat to the social body. In other words, how does the state manage those populations that it deems deviant or abject? And this is where our story really begins. Feminist theorist Saidiya Hartman argues that Black women's wombs are the locus of modern American society. She begins her famous essay, The Belly of the World, with this haunting quote: "The slave ship is a womb, abyss. The plantation is the belly of the world. Partus sequitur ventrum. The child follows the belly. The master dreams of future increase. The modern world follows the belly." Enslaved Black women were exploited for their physical, sexual, and reproductive labor. Many masters raped their Black female slaves as a means to produce more labor or a source of income for their plantations. Even if the child was the product of a voluntary relationship between themselves and another man, free or enslaved Black women knew that their offspring would become an object in the master's economy. One method by which enslaved Black women took back control over their bodies and their reproductive capacities was to perform their own abortions, as Angela Davis explains. She writes that, quote, many slave women refused to bring children into a world of interminable forced labor, where chains and flogging and sexual abuse for women were the everyday conditions of life, end quote. The conditions under which Black and Latina women choose abortions post-Reconstruction were different, but the context of structural racism and poverty remained. Quote, when Black and Latina women resort to abortions in large numbers, the stories they tell are not so much about their desire to be free of their pregnancy, but rather the miserable social conditions which dissuade them from bringing new lives into the world. The early abortion rights campaigns missed this key point. Women of color wanted access to abortions, but they also wanted to change the social conditions that prohibited them from having more children. In the middle of the 19th century, white American women like abolitionist Sarah Grimke began to argue for women's right to decide when to become a mother or not become one, and under what circumstances. In other words, the voluntary motherhood we spoke of before. This was also the moment of the quote-unquote emancipated marriage of Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, abolitionists and women's rights activists who were married in a ceremony that intentionally protested women's traditional relinquishment of their right to their persons, name, and property in marriage. The movement for voluntary motherhood gained popularity when it was picked up by the women's suffrage movement in the 1870s. As Davis writes, suffrage leaders realized that if women were burdened with incessant childbirths, they could never fully exercise their political rights. It is important to note, however, that this image of an emancipated woman remains bound to the lifestyles of middle-class and bourgeois women. Working-class women during this time were fighting for their very survival. Voluntary motherhood was not their first or even second priority. This was a movement of relatively privileged women. By the 1890s, the white birth rate in America had dropped significantly. There were many reasons for this drop, but officials and the media interpreted it in a racist and anti-working class fashion. In 1905, the President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt, used his Lincoln Day dinner speech, ironically, to proclaim that, quote, race purity must be maintained.